I came home 2 days early, just in time for my son's wedding. But when I opened the door to the villa, my wife wasn't there. Instead, there were medical waste bags shoved hastily onto the porch. The familiar smell of medicine still hung in the air, sharp, unmistakable. My son said his mother had been taken in for special treatment. That's the phrase he used. But her hearing aid was lying under the bed, and the medicine cabinet, the one that never left her side, was locked, empty. Before I go on, if you're listening to this story right now, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Not for the numbers, but because I want to know what kind of people in what places are being touched by stories like this. And now, let me take you back to the moment I stepped into that house. The place where everything began to fall silent, in a way that felt deeply wrong. I stood in the foyer for a long time, surrounded by white flowers and lights hung higher than usual. This house had never been this quiet. Normally, Susan kept the radio on low in the kitchen, just loud enough to soften the ticking of the clock. That day, there was nothing, only a dry, cold silence, as if the house itself was trying to hide something. I pulled my suitcase inside. The wheels screeched across the wooden floor, a harsh sound, like a reminder that I wasn't supposed to be here this early. I called my wife's name. No answer. I called again. Slower, clearer, still nothing. No familiar footsteps. No gentle question Susan always asked when I came home late. Out on the porch, medical waste bags were mixed in with wedding decorations, disposable gloves, empty pill bottles, used bandages. I bent down and picked up an empty medicine box. The label had been torn off, but I recognized the color instantly. It was the kind Susan took every single day. There was no reason to throw it away, and certainly not like this, careless, rushed. I walked down the hallway and up to the second floor. Our bedroom door was slightly open. The bed had been made. Too neat. Unfamiliar. Susan never made the bed like that. She always left a small fold at the corner of the blanket, so I'd know she was awake somewhere in the house. That day, there was no fold. I knelt down and looked under the bed. Her hearing aid was there, covered in dust. I picked it up, and my hand froze. Susan never went anywhere without it, not even to sleep. She once told me, if she couldn't hear me call her, she would feel lost. And now it lay there in silence, as if someone had dropped it in a hurry. I moved to the medical cabinet by the window. The lock had been changed. I didn't have a key. That stopped me for a few seconds, long enough to wonder if I had ever agreed to this. I hadn't. Never. I leaned my ear against the cabinet door, as if I might hear something inside. No bottles, clinking. No movement. I knew it was empty before I opened it. And when I finally forced the lock, that emptiness felt louder than the room itself. John appeared in the doorway. He looked busy, well-dressed, like someone coordinating a major event. He said his mother had been admitted for inpatient treatment, somewhere quiet, far from the city. He handed me a test report, explaining that her condition had worsened and the doctors recommended it. The paperwork looked legitimate, too legitimate. I asked why no one had called me. John said I was overseas, and they didn't want to worry me. The calm way he said it made me feel cold. I looked straight into my son's eyes, searching for something familiar. There was nothing, only a brief flicker of avoidance, just enough for me to notice. In the days that followed, the house kept filling up. People came and went, bringing flowers, lights, polite laughter. I walked among them, like a guest who didn't belong in his own home. No one asked where Susan was. No one mentioned her. It was as if she had been crossed out of every plan. I began to notice small details. The basement door was always covered by a new rug. Susan used to go down there to check storage. She hated rugs, said they were slippery. Now the rug lay there thick, heavy, unmoving, as if meant to hide something. At night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my study, flipping through old drawings. I've spent my life reading spaces, noticing when a structure changes, even slightly. This house had changed, not because of wedding decorations, but because something had been sealed shut. I didn't rush to conclusions. I didn't call the police. I didn't make a scene. I just remembered. Every look, every locked door, every careful sentence. I knew one thing. If Susan were truly in treatment, there would be no reason to erase her traces like this. On the morning of the third day, while everyone else was still asleep, I stood alone in the living room. Early light fell across the new rug. Beneath my feet, the wooden floor made a faint sound, one it had never made before. I didn't move, and in that moment I understood that the silence in this house was not an accident, and I also understood something else. Susan had never left this place. I didn't step back right away. I stood there on that rug for a long time, as if breathing a little too hard might make the truth beneath it disappear. I bent down and touched the edge of the rug. It was thick, heavy, new, too new for the rest of the room. Susan used to say that new things in this house always threw her off balance, and yet no one had asked her. I pulled the rug aside. There was no loud sound, just a square wooden panel fitted so perfectly into the floor it was easy to miss. I knelt down and pressed my ear against it. At first I thought I was mistaken. Then I heard it. A very faint sound, not a voice, more like an alarm, muffled, repeating, tired, desperate. I opened the hatch. Cold air rushed up and hit my face. Narrow steps led downward, the light swallowed after just a few steps. I didn't call Susan's name. I was afraid that if I did, the sound would stop, and I would convince myself this was all in my head. The basement was low and sealed in. A figure sat against the wall. It took me a few seconds to understand it was my wife. Susan was much thinner. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. Her eyes widened when she saw me, as if she didn't dare believe it. I knelt in front of her and took her shaking hands in mine. They were cold, dry. I didn't ask what had happened. I reached into my jacket, took out her medication, placed it in her hand, and helped her drink small sips of water. She was shaking so badly, I had to hold the cup steady. Her breathing slowly calmed, but her eyes never left my face, like I might disappear if she blinked. Around us were things that didn't belong in a basement: a folding bed, a small table, and a tablet resting on a wooden crate. On the screen was my account interface. I understood everything in that moment: why the medicine cabinet had been locked, why Susan had been kept here. No explanation was needed. I heard footsteps on the wooden floor above. I turned off the flashlight and pulled Susan into the corner of the dark. The hatch was still slightly open, just enough for me to hear familiar voices. John and Amanda stepped into the living room. Their voices sounded relaxed, like everything was under control. They talked about the guest list, about items that would be moved out after the wedding. Amanda laughed and said the estate would be closed sooner than expected. John replied with a flat joke, that everything would go smoothly as long as everyone did their part. I tightened my grip on Susan's hand. She gently shook her head, asking me not to make a sound. Amanda mentioned me. She said a plan was already in place, convincing enough that no one would ask questions. I didn't catch the details. I didn't need to. The way they spoke told me exactly where I stood in that story. When the footsteps faded away, I finally exhaled. Susan whispered that they had come down here many times. They would place the tablet in front of her, ask her to put her hand on it to approve transactions she didn't understand. Each time she hesitated, the medication was taken away. She said it in a flat voice, as if she were talking about someone else. I didn't take Susan out right away, not because I hesitated, but because I knew this house was no longer safe. Security had appeared ever since the wedding preparations began. Unfamiliar faces, eyes that didn't ask questions. I couldn't take the risk. From that night on, I went down to the basement whenever the house fell silent. I brought food, medicine, and time. I sat beside Susan and listened. She told me about the long hours in the dark, about how her greatest fear wasn't being held there but being forgotten. I promised her that would never happen. During the day, I played the role of an ordinary father. I nodded, signed papers, listened to plans spoken right in front of me. At night, I remembered, every sentence drifting down into the basement, every figure flashing across the tablet screen. I've spent my entire life reading drawings and structures. What they were doing had a very clear structure, and every structure has a weakness. One night, as I prepared to leave the basement, Susan held my hand tighter than usual. She asked if I was sure. I looked at her, at the woman who had walked beside me for more than 40 years, and I nodded, not because I was sure of victory, but because I had no other choice. When I closed the hatch again, the small alarm was still sounding somewhere below. But this time, it didn't feel desperate. It felt like a count. And I knew that from that moment on, this house no longer belonged to people who thought they could hide everything under a brand new rug. After that night, I began living two lives inside the same house. By day, I was the father who came back on time, signing papers already laid out for me, listening to wedding plans as if everything were perfectly normal. By night, I became the quiet gatekeeper of the basement, bringing down medication, soft food, and short sentences, just enough for Susan to know she hadn't been abandoned. I left no traces, no extra lights, no moved objects. I understood that any change could be noticed. The architecture of silence demands discipline. I learned that over an entire career. Susan slowly stabilized once she had her medication again, but the exhaustion never left her face. She didn't ask what I was going to do. She only asked if I still remembered the smell of morning coffee. I nodded. That was how we kept ourselves awake in the dark. I started reviewing the accounts I had once trusted John to manage, quietly. No confrontations, no direct questions. I used the old computer in my study, logging in step by step. Slow, careful. Numbers don't lie. They told me a different story. Clear, cold. A large sum had been taken from the family trust. $800,000. The note was brief and vague, written to look like a routine investment, but the recipient address was familiar. A high-rise apartment in New York, registered under Amanda's name. I checked the date. It matched the week Susan began her so-called treatment. I wasn't angry right away. I felt a hollow space open in front of me, where every piece finally slid into place. Susan wasn't held because she was weak. She was held because she was the key. I needed evidence, not suspicion. Time, not confrontation. And I needed someone who understood the law here better than I did. I called an old friend, a former local police chief. We hadn't spoken in years. I only said I needed advice. He recognized my voice immediately. We met at a small diner outside town. I didn't tell him everything. Just enough for him to understand that someone was being held against their will and that the cover-up was careful. He didn't ask for details. He talked me through legal ways to gather the truth without making everything collapse too soon. From that point on, the house began remembering for me. Small devices were placed where no one ever looked, not to spy, but to listen. I didn't interfere. I let things unfold as they naturally would. People speak the most when they believe they are safe. In the nights that followed, I sat in my study listening to the recordings. Not always clear, but clear enough. Clear enough to hear how John and Amanda spoke about me, about Susan, about this estate. They spoke as if everything had already been decided, as if I were just a footnote, about to be erased. Amanda talked about closing old doors to open a new life. John spoke less, but whenever he did, he talked about timing. After the wedding, after everyone had left, after nothing could be undone. I didn't sleep much, but I wasn't tired. Each new piece of information made me more awake. I began reorganizing my legal documents one file at a time, not to make rash changes, but to prepare. I've built structures that stood for decades, because I never waited for cracks before reinforcing them. Susan noticed the change in me. She asked if I was building something again. I said yes. But this time I wasn't building with concrete or steel. I was building with truth. One evening as I prepared to leave the basement, Susan placed her hand on my wrist. She said she was afraid. Not for herself, but for me. I told her my greatest fear had already passed. The moment I stood on that rug in the living room and realized she had never left this house, I closed the hatch like always. Upstairs, laughter drifted in from the dining room. They were testing the wedding menu. I stood there, listening, remembering. Every laugh became a timestamp. Every careless sentence another brick laid on their fragile foundation. I wasn't in a hurry. I knew a climax only matters when it's placed exactly right. And when the wedding day arrives, this house will no longer be silent. It will speak for me, with everything that has been uncovered layer by layer. The wedding day arrived faster than I expected. The estate woke up early, not to birdsong, but to engines, raised voices, and the smell of fresh flowers covering every path. Everything was arranged with a perfection that felt cold. I stood on the second-floor balcony, looking down at the courtyard where long tables had been draped in white cloth. No one knew that beneath those polished wooden floors the truth was still locked away. Susan was brought upstairs before the guests arrived, not to appear, but to wait. She sat in a wheelchair, hands resting calmly on her lap, her expression more peaceful than I thought possible. I adjusted the thin shawl on her shoulders. We didn't speak. Between us, silence was enough. John appeared in a tailored suit. He hugged me quickly, like a gesture practiced in front of a mirror. He said today was a big day, that he was happy I was there. I nodded. I didn't congratulate him. I just looked at my son, trying to remember his face while everything was still intact. The ceremony began. Music played softly, steady, and controlled. The garden filled with guests, familiar faces from business circles, polite smiles. Amanda stepped out in her white dress, her eyes lighting up at everything she believed belonged to her. She didn't look toward Susan. When it was time for speeches, John took the microphone. His voice was steady. He spoke about love, about new beginnings. Then he mentioned a special gift that my father has generously given. This estate, he said, would now belong to him and his wife, a symbol of trust and continuity. A few scattered claps followed. I stood up. No one noticed right away. They thought I was stepping out for air. I signaled to the technician. He nodded. The large screen behind the stage meant for a highlight video lit up. At first, the images were familiar. John and Amanda smiling, walking together. Carefully selected moments. The guests relaxed. Then the image cut. No introduction. No music. A low room. Dim light. Susan appeared on the screen, sitting against a wall, hands, trembling eyes fixed on something above her. No one understood what they were seeing. A few whispers spread through the crowd. Then the sound came. Amanda's voice. Close. Clear. She spoke about timing, about patience, about how everything would eventually be handled. Another voice replied. More cautious, more familiar. John. He said they only needed to wait a little longer, that everything would be fine. The air in the garden shifted. Smiles faded. One person stood up, then another. I stepped forward, pushing Susan's wheelchair. The wheels rolled over the gravel path, a steady, deliberate sound. I stopped in the center of the courtyard where every eye had turned. Susan raised her hand, asking for the microphone. The host hesitated, then handed it to her. She held it with both hands. Her voice was weak, but clear. She read out numbers. No emotion, no accusations, just amounts of money taken from the fund meant for her own care. Dates, electronic signatures, confirmed by the fingerprint of someone who had no choice. John stood frozen. Amanda stepped back, then another step. For the first time, confusion showed on her face. Uncovered, people began leaving their seats. Phones came out. No one clapped anymore. I didn't say much. I only said that this house had remembered everything, and today it chose to speak. I signaled again. The screen went dark. Nothing more was needed. Officials appeared at the edge of the garden. Quiet, orderly. They moved toward John and Amanda, with the calm of people who had been waiting. I didn't watch for long. I bent down and asked Susan if she was tired. She nodded slightly. When they were led away, no one stopped it. The wedding ended there. There was no formal announcement, only a heavy silence settling over the garden, different from the silence of the days before. This one hid nothing. It confirmed everything. I pushed Susan out of the garden past rows of half-used chairs. A few people lowered their heads as we passed. I didn't respond. I focused on the wheels of the chair. Steady, slow. Behind me, the estate still stood as grand as ever. But I knew that from this moment on, everything had changed. Not with shouting, not with chaos, but because the truth had been placed exactly where it belonged, in the middle of the day they believed was safest. After that day, the estate was no longer a place for parties. It returned to its natural rhythm, slow, steady, honest. I brought Susan back to her room and opened the windows to let the sunlight in. She sat quietly in her chair, eyes closed for a long moment, as if relearning how to trust that this house would never lock her below again. I made coffee. The familiar smell spread through the room, and for the first time in weeks, Susan said she felt like morning had returned. The formalities that followed moved in proper order. No rush, no noise. I signed the documents I had prepared in advance one by one. Ownership was reaffirmed. Irregular transactions were frozen. The money taken from the fund meant for Susan's care was formally requested back. I didn't use harsh language. I simply asked that everything be put back where it belonged. John didn't reach out. Neither did Amanda. I didn't wait. I had said everything that needed to be said, in the only way that still carried weight. By placing the truth on the table, the rest was no longer mine to feel. A week later, I opened the estate gates to the first visitors. Not guests, but elderly people from the area, those who no longer had a place to rest in peace. They walked slowly, asked little, observed carefully. I guided them through the halls, showed them rooms that had been quietly renovated, pathways without high steps, handrails placed where they were needed. I had converted this place long ago, on paper. Only now did it truly begin living up to its name. Susan took part in every small detail. She chose curtain colors, checked the lighting in the common room, spoke gently with each person who arrived. Her illness hadn't disappeared. Her hands still trembled. But the fear was gone. I could see it in the way she lingered longer on the porch, in the way she called my name without needing to raise her voice. In the afternoons, we sat by the veranda, where the wind moved through old trees. I watched the newcomers settle in, slowly, carefully. No one was rushed. No one was forgotten. I realized then, I had spent my life building structures for others. Only now had I truly completed something for myself. Some nights I still wake up, not from anger, but from memory. I don't push those memories away. I let them be, then set them down like placing a finished blueprint into a drawer. Susan sleeps more peacefully now. She says the darkness no longer feels as heavy. I believe her. One morning I received the final notice. The estate's transition into a fully recognized nonprofit facility had been officially approved. I folded the paper and placed it on the table. Susan smiled. Not a smile of victory. Just the relief of someone who has walked through a door and knows they don't need to go back. We planted another tree by the porch. Susan said it would grow slowly, but it would last. I agreed. We didn't need to see it grow tall in a single day. We only needed to know it had roots. As the sun set, light stretching across the yard, I thought about legacy. Not money, not names, but the way a place can change the fate of those who walk into it. I thought about what had closed and what had opened. There was no applause, no declaration, only the quiet continuation of what was right. I held Susan's hand. Her hand was warm. She leaned gently against my shoulder. We sat there listening to the wind, to distant footsteps of people who had found a place to stay for the night. I knew then, this story didn't end with punishment. It ended with things being set back in order, and for me, that was enough. If you've stayed with me until these final lines, thank you for your patience. This story isn't meant to stir anger. It's meant to remind us that silence can hide pain. But truth, when placed where it belongs, can save a person and an entire family. If this story made you reflect, please tap like to support the channel. Subscribe to continue walking with us through more real-life stories. And share it if you believe this message needs to travel further. The final lesson is simple. A person's value isn't found in what they take, but in how they protect the most vulnerable beside them. Family is not a place to exploit. It is a place to preserve. Thank you for listening, all the way to the end.